The whistle tears through the dawn like a blade. Men already blackened with coal dust step from the darkness and walk toward a structure so large it seems less like a machine and more like a living thing waiting to be fed. The ground trembles beneath their boots, steam drifts across the yard in thick white clouds, hissing from iron joints and pressure valves. Somewhere deep inside the colossal frame, pistons begin to move, a slow, thunderous rhythm. Iron striking iron, steel plates groaning as thousands of tons of machinery awaken. The furnace doors swing open, and a wave of heat spills outward, searing the morning air. Fire roars inside the chamber, bright enough to turn faces into silhouettes. The men do not hesitate. They shovel, haul, and drag black stone toward the mouth of the beast. Coal. Car after car arrives from the mine's raw, jagged fuel torn from deep beneath the earth. Each load disappears into the furnace's glowing throat, swallowed by flames that never seem satisfied. Above them rises the machine itself. A towering lattice of girders and wheels, conveyor belts clattering like chains, smokestacks vomiting black clouds into the sky. At its heart sits a massive steel furnace taller than a six-story building designed to consume more coal in a single day than an entire mining town once burned in a year. The men call it many things: the Iron Giant, the Furnace King. But among the miners another name spreads quietly through the camps: the Steel Leviathan. Because once it began to feed, it never stopped. Railroad tracks stretch across the continent because of it. Cities rise from forests because of it. Entire industries depend on the rivers of molten metal pouring from its crucibles. But the Leviathan demands payment. Every rail, forged in its fire, carries the weight of something buried beneath the steel. Coal dust in the lungs, collapsed tunnels, boilers that burst like artillery, men who entered the mines and never returned. The question that haunted the industrial age was never whether the Leviathan could build a nation. The question was how many lives it would devour to do it. Industrial civilization rarely announces its true cost. From a distance, the transformation of the 19th century appeared almost miraculous. Within a single lifetime, landscapes that had once been silent wilderness became threaded with steel rails. Towns emerged where forests once stood. Factories rose beside rivers, and locomotives began to cross distances that had previously required weeks of brutal travel. Railroads became the nervous system of a new nation. Steel rails carried wheat from the plains, timber from northern forests, and ore from the mountains. Entire economies reorganized themselves around the iron pathways stretching across valleys and deserts. Cities grew where tracks converged. Fortunes appeared where none had existed before. To the public, the railroad symbolized progress, speed, power, unity. But hidden beneath that triumphant narrative lay a mechanical appetite so vast that few people truly understood it. A single mile of railroad track required nearly 100 tons of steel. Producing that steel demanded enormous blast furnaces operating at temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Each furnace consumed mountains of raw material: iron ore hauled from distant mines, limestone quarried from hillsides, and above all else, coal. Coal was the blood of the machine. Without coal, the furnaces went dark. Without furnaces, the rail mills stopped. Without rails, the dream of a continent-spanning railroad collapsed. By the 1870s, the industrial complex's feeding railroad expansion had reached a scale previously unimaginable. A single large furnace could devour more than 500 tons of coal every 24 hours, burning day and night without pause. Entire trainloads of black rock arrived continuously, tipped into towering storage piles that stretched for acres. The furnaces never slept, and because they never slept, neither did the systems feeding them. Deep underground, thousands of miners descended into narrow tunnels carved through unstable layers of rock and shale. Their work supplied the fuel required to keep the industrial engines alive above ground. The connection between mine and furnace formed a brutal chain. Every shovel of coal hauled from the earth moved through rail cars, conveyors, crushers, and boilers until it finally vanished into the incandescent core of the steelworks. There, the coal's energy transformed iron into rails that would stretch across thousands of miles. From the perspective of industrial planners, the equation was simple. More coal meant more steel. More steel meant more railroad. More railroad meant national power. But the equation contained a hidden variable rarely written into company ledgers: human bodies. Mining coal in the 19th century was among the most dangerous occupations on Earth. Miners worked in tunnels sometimes less than 3 feet high, crawling through darkness with oil lamps that barely pierced the dust-filled air. Explosive gases accumulated silently in the shafts. Timber supports cracked without warning. Entire sections of mine could collapse in seconds. A single cave-in could bury dozens of men. Yet production quotas continued to rise. Steel companies demanded uninterrupted fuel deliveries. Rail companies demanded uninterrupted steel production. Investors demanded uninterrupted profits. The machine's appetite expanded faster every year. Between 1865 and 1890, railroad mileage in the United States exploded from roughly 35,000 miles to more than 163,000 miles, to more than 163,000 miles. Each mile required steel rails forged in furnaces that could only operate if coal flowed continuously from the mines. This created an industrial paradox that defined the age. The same system that connected cities and enabled national prosperity also generated a relentless pressure on the workers who fed it. Every delay underground risked shutting down a furnace. Every shutdown risked halting rail production. Every halted rail shipment threatened the expansion of the railroad itself. So the Leviathan demanded speed, faster digging, longer shifts, deeper mines. In mining towns scattered across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, men began to understand the reality behind the promises of industrial progress. The railroads that symbolized national unity were being forged by a machine that consumed more than coal. It consumed exhaustion. It consumed safety. And sometimes it consumed the miners themselves. For every shining rail that stretched across the American landscape, somewhere beneath the earth a tunnel grew deeper, darker, and more dangerous, feeding the furnace that would never stop asking for more. Before steel rails stitched the continent together, distance ruled the nation like an invisible tyrant. Travel across the United States in the early 19th century was an exercise in endurance rather than efficiency. Roads were often little more than hardened mud tracks carved through forests and fields. Wagons lurched slowly across uneven ground, their wooden wheels splintering under heavy loads. Horses strained against harnesses for days at a time, advancing no more than 15 to 20 miles in a single day. For farmers, merchants, and settlers, geography imposed a relentless barrier. A shipment of grain from Ohio to the eastern seaboard might require weeks of travel by wagon. Timber cut in northern forests could rot before reaching distant markets. Even letters moved slowly, carried by stagecoaches rattling across dangerous terrain. Rivers provided partial relief, but they were unreliable masters. Flatboats drifted downstream with cargo bound for southern ports, yet traveling against the current remained painfully slow. Steamboats improved speed along major waterways, but vast regions of the interior remained isolated from navigable rivers entirely. Distance fractured the economy. A farmer might harvest abundant wheat only to discover there was no profitable way to transport it. Iron ore deposits in remote mountains remained untouched because hauling them to furnaces would cost more than the metal itself. Entire communities lived within economic bubbles, producing goods that could never reach distant buyers. In the decades following independence, this geographic isolation became a growing national concern. Political leaders feared that the young republic might fracture along regional lines. Without reliable transportation, distant territories could drift away from the economic orbit of eastern cities. The vast lands west of the Mississippi remained difficult to govern, difficult to supply, and even more difficult to integrate into a unified national economy. The challenge was not merely political, it was mechanical. Moving massive quantities of goods across enormous distances required a transportation system capable of carrying weight, maintaining speed, and operating in nearly every climate. Wagons could not accomplish this task. Rivers alone could not solve it. Only one technology possessed the necessary power: the steam locomotive. When early railroads began appearing in the 1830s and 1840s, their impact was immediate and transformative. A locomotive pulling a train of freight cars could haul hundreds of tons of cargo at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, a staggering improvement over horse-drawn transport. But the true promise of railroads lay in scale. Tracks could cross mountains, deserts, and plains with a reliability no river could match. Steel rails created permanent corridors of movement that ignored seasonal floods, frozen waterways, and muddy roads. For industrialists and investors, the implications were enormous. A railroad network stretching across the continent could transform scattered markets into a single national economy. Grain grown in Kansas could reach factories in New England. Coal mined in Pennsylvania could power furnaces hundreds of miles away. Manufactured goods could travel outward to towns that had once been isolated by geography. Distance would no longer control the nation. The nation would conquer distance. Yet the engineering dream of a continental railroad faced a brutal practical obstacle: steel. Early railroads often relied on iron rails, but iron bent and fractured under the immense weight of locomotives. As trains grew heavier and faster, iron rails warped, cracked, and sometimes shattered completely. Accidents multiplied as rails failed beneath moving trains. To build a network capable of carrying the industrial future, something stronger was required. Steel rails could endure heavier loads and longer service life. A steel track might survive 10 to 20 times longer than its iron predecessor, but producing steel on the scale required for national rail construction demanded furnaces of unprecedented size and power. Furnaces that required enormous fuel, coal, and so the solution to the nation's transportation crisis produced another crisis beneath the surface. Every mile of railroad that conquered distance required an industrial furnace burning day and night. Every furnace demanded a constant river of coal hauled from the depths of the earth. As railroad maps expanded across the continent, the appetite of the steel industry expanded with them. Distance had once strangled the nation. Now the effort to defeat distance was creating a new force, one that would reshape landscapes, economies, and human lives with equal intensity. A machine had been born that could build a nation, but it could only do so by feeding on the darkness below the ground. In the middle decades of the 19th century, steel ceased to be a rare material. For centuries, producing steel had been a slow and expensive craft. Blacksmiths created small quantities by heating iron in charcoal furnaces and hammering it repeatedly to remove impurities. The process demanded patience, skill, and time. Steel tools existed, but they were precious objects, too costly to build entire transportation systems from. Railroads changed that equation overnight. As railroad companies expanded westward, the demand for stronger rails grew impossible to ignore. Iron rails bent beneath the pounding weight of locomotives. Heavy freight trains left twisted metal in their wake. Derailments became common, and every broken rail threatened not only cargo but human lives. Industrialists began searching for a way to manufacture steel faster and in vastly larger quantities. The breakthrough arrived with the Bessemer process, introduced in the 1850s. Instead of slowly refining iron by hand, molten pig iron could be transformed into steel by blasting air through it inside a massive converter vessel. The oxygen burned away excess carbon and impurities, producing large volumes of steel in minutes rather than days. What had once been artisanal metal became industrial material. Steel production exploded. In 1860, the United States produced only 13,000 tons of steel annually. By 1880, that number had surged to over 1.2 million tons, much of it destined for railroad construction. New steel mills appeared across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, their furnaces rising above the landscape like iron fortresses. These complexes were not simple workshops, they were industrial ecosystems. A typical steelworks required blast furnaces towering 60 to 100 feet high, rail mills stretching hundreds of yards, and sprawling yards filled with coal, iron ore, and limestone. Rail lines connected every part of the complex, carrying raw materials inward and finished steel outward. The blast furnace stood at the center of this world. Inside its towering shell, iron ore, limestone, and coke-purified form of coal were poured through the furnace top in carefully measured layers. Heated air blasted into the furnace through powerful pipes called tuyeras, driving temperatures high enough to melt iron itself. Within the furnace, chemical reactions unfolded with relentless intensity. Carbon from the coke combined with oxygen to generate immense heat. Impurities separated from molten iron and floated upward as slag. The furnace's interior glowed white-hot, transforming rock into liquid metal that flowed downward into collection channels. From the outside, the furnace roared like a living volcano. Molten iron spilled from tapping holes into glowing channels that carried it toward the converters where steel would be born. Sparks erupted into the air. Workers moved through the heat wearing thick leather aprons and iron-faced shields, guiding streams of metal hotter than any natural fire. Yet the furnace possessed one defining trait: it could never stop. Once ignited, a blast furnace had to operate continuously. Cooling it down would solidify metal inside the structure, potentially destroying the entire system. The fire had to burn without interruption, sometimes for years at a time. This created an unforgiving demand for fuel. Each large furnace consumed staggering quantities of coke derived from coal. Producing 1 ton of steel required roughly 1.5 tons of coal, burned either directly in the furnace or converted into coke within nearby ovens. A single major steel plant could require thousands of tons of coal every day. And as railroads expanded westward, new furnaces appeared to meet the demand. Entire valleys became dominated by industrial complexes where smokestacks darkened the sky and the glow of furnaces lit the night horizon. From a distance, the steelworks resembled a city of fire. Within its boundaries, machines operated in a carefully choreographed sequence. Ore arrived by rail, coal arrived by rail, limestone arrived by rail. Conveyors lifted materials toward furnace tops. Molten metal flowed into converters, then into rolling mills where massive machines squeezed red-hot steel into long rails. Each rail measured roughly 30 feet in length, glowing orange as it emerged from the rollers before cooling in long lines across the yard. Thousands of these rails left the mill every week. Together they formed the skeletal structure of a transportation empire that would stretch from Atlantic harbors to Pacific ports. But behind the triumph of steel production stood an enormous supply chain buried beneath the surface. The furnaces might dominate the skyline, yet far away from the glowing mills, deep underground in coal seams carved through mountains and hills, another workforce labored in darkness to keep the Leviathan alive. Because the steelworks could not exist without coal, and the coal could only be obtained by men willing to descend into the earth. To an outsider approaching one of the great steelworks of the late 19th century, the first impression was scale. The complex did not resemble a single factory. It resembled a mechanical city. Towering blast furnaces rose like iron cathedrals above the landscape, their cylindrical shells wrapped in ladders, pipes, and platforms. Rail lines crisscrossed the grounds in every direction. Conveyor belts rattled overhead, carrying raw materials from massive storage yards toward the furnace tops. Smoke poured endlessly from chimneys that could reach 200 feet into the sky. Day and night, the complex vibrated with motion. The entire system existed to accomplish one task: transforming raw earth into steel rails capable of supporting the expanding weight of the railroad age. The process began long before metal ever melted. At the edge of the steelworks stood enormous ore yards where iron ore delivered from distant mines arrived in trainloads. The rock was dumped into piles that stretched across acres, each mound containing thousands of tons of mineral waiting to be consumed. Nearby stood equally vast coal yards. The coal arriving here had already traveled from deep mines scattered across Pennsylvania and Appalachia, yet it could not be used immediately. First, it had to pass through a transformation that turned raw coal into coke, the purified fuel required for blast furnace operation. This transformation took place inside coke ovens. Rows of brick ovens stretched across entire hillsides, sometimes numbering hundreds in a single facility. Each oven was a narrow chamber where coal was heated in the absence of oxygen for nearly 24 hours. The intense heat drove out impurities and volatile gases, leaving behind porous black coke that burned hotter and cleaner than ordinary coal. Workers pushed blowing coke from the ovens using long iron rakes, sending cascades of sparks into the air as the material cooled. From there, the fuel moved toward the heart of the complex, the blast furnace. Each furnace was a towering steel shell lined internally with fire brick, capable of withstanding extreme temperatures. At the furnace's top, mechanical hoists lifted massive buckets filled with iron ore, coke, and limestone. These materials were dumped inside in carefully measured layers. At the base of the furnace, enormous air pumps forced blasts of superheated air through pipes known as tuyeres. This air fed the combustion process, driving temperatures beyond 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit hot enough to melt iron completely. Inside the furnace, gravity and chemistry worked together. As the materials descended through the interior, the coke burned fiercely, producing heat and carbon monoxide gas. The gas stripped oxygen from the iron ore, leaving molten iron behind. Limestone combined with impurities to form slag, a lighter substance that floated above the metal. Every few hours, workers opened a tapping hole near the furnace's base. Molten iron erupted outward in a glowing stream, flowing along sand-lined channels into massive ladles mounted on rail cars. Sparks showered the surrounding yard, illuminating workers who guided the flow using long steel rods. This was only the beginning. The molten iron moved next to the Bessemer converters, huge pear-shaped vessels mounted on pivoting frames. Each converter could hold 10 to 15 tons of molten metal at a time. When filled, powerful jets of air blasted upward through the liquid iron. The reaction was violent. Impurities ignited instantly, producing flames that roared from the converter's mouth like a jet of fire. The entire vessel glowed as carbon burned away. Within minutes, the iron transformed into steel. Once refined, the molten steel poured into long molds called ingots, but the ingots themselves were only intermediate forms. Still glowing with heat, they traveled toward the rolling mills where the steel would finally become rails. Inside these vast halls stood rows of enormous rollers driven by steam-powered engines. Each pair of rollers squeezed the metal flatter and longer as it passed through. Workers guided the blazing steel with iron tongs, moving it from one set of rollers to the next. Each pass stretched the metal further. First the ingot became a bar, then a longer bar, then finally a rail nearly 30 feet in length, glowing orange as it emerged from the final rollers. The rail slid onto cooling beds where it slowly lost its heat, hardening into the rigid backbone of the railroad network. Throughout the entire process, the system functioned like a single organism. If coal delivery slowed, the coke ovens could not operate. Without coke, the blast furnaces cooled. Without molten iron, the converters stood idle. Without steel, the rolling mills fell silent. The machine required continuous motion. Coal in, steel out, every hour, every day, every year. From a distance, the steelworks appeared unstoppable, a fortress of industry whose machinery operated with mechanical precision. But beneath the immense power of the system lay fragile foundations. Because every stage of the process depended on forces that could easily turn deadly, explosive gases, immense pressure, extreme heat, and the constant demand for coal mined under dangerous conditions. The Leviathan looked invincible. Yet within its vast body, danger waited in every pipe, every tunnel, and every furnace wall. From the outside, the industrial machine appeared perfectly ordered. Trains arrived on schedule, furnaces burned with controlled intensity, steel rails rolled from the mills in steady glowing lines. To investors and engineers observing from a distance, the system seemed like a triumph of human organization, an industrial organism operating with mechanical precision. But deep within its foundations lay a series of fragile balances. Every stage of production relied on forces that could turn catastrophic in an instant. The steelworks itself contained enormous reservoirs of danger. Blast furnaces operated under tremendous internal pressure. Superheated gases surged through iron pipes that stretched across the complex. Boilers powering steam engines held water heated far beyond its natural boiling point. If any of these systems failed, the results could be violent. A single ruptured pipe could release a blast of steam capable of stripping flesh from bone. A cracked furnace lining might allow molten metal liquid rock, glowing brighter than daylight, to escape into the surrounding structure. Boiler explosions, among the most feared events in industrial facilities, could send iron fragments flying like artillery shells across hundreds of feet. Yet even these hazards were only part of the machine's hidden instability. The true vulnerability existed far away from the furnaces themselves. It existed in the coal mines. Steel production demanded enormous quantities of coke, and coke required coal mined in staggering volumes. By the late 19th century, industrial furnaces across the United States consumed tens of millions of tons of coal every year. Entire regions became dedicated to feeding this appetite. Coal companies responded by driving their mines deeper into the earth. Early mines had followed coal seams that appeared near the surface. But as demand increased, these easily accessible deposits were quickly exhausted. New shafts had to descend hundreds of feet underground, reaching coal layers buried beneath unstable rock formations. The deeper miners traveled, the more dangerous the environment became. Ventilation systems struggled to circulate fresh air through miles of narrow tunnels. Dust accumulated in thick clouds along the walls and ceilings. Methane, gas odorless and invisible, seeped constantly from the surrounding coal seams. Methane required only a spark to ignite, and inside the mines, sparks were everywhere. Steel tools struck stone. Lantern flames flickered in cramped tunnels. Electrical equipment began appearing in larger operations, introducing new ignition sources into already volatile environments. When methane mixed with suspended coal dust, the result could become explosive. A single ignition could produce a shock wave racing through the mine's tunnels at terrifying speed. Walls collapsed, timber supports splintered, entire chambers filled instantly with flame and choking gases. Miners referred to these events with a quiet, almost fatalistic phrase, a blast. The statistics revealed the scale of the danger. During the late 19th century, coal mining in the United States routinely claimed more than 1,000 lives every year. Some disasters killed dozens of workers at once. Others entombed entire shifts beneath collapsed rock. Yet production quotas continued to rise. Steel mills could not reduce their fuel consumption. Railroads continued demanding more rails for expanding networks across the continent. Investors pushed companies to maintain uninterrupted output. Every delay threatened profits. Every pause threatened the momentum of industrial expansion. As a result, safety systems often lagged behind the scale of production. Ventilation tunnels were sometimes inadequate. Gas detection remained primitive. Timber supports weakened under the strain of expanding mine networks. Miners understood the danger better than anyone. They worked inside the tunnels every day. They heard the groaning sounds of shifting rock. They felt the sudden stillness when ventilation faltered. They saw the dust drifting through the lamplight dust that could become explosive under the right conditions. Yet most had little choice but to continue. Mining towns depended entirely on coal production. Wages supported families living in company-owned houses. Stores, schools, and churches all existed within the economic orbit of the mine. To walk away from the work meant abandoning an entire community. So the miners returned underground each morning, descending through wooden shafts and iron cages into a world where every shift balanced between routine labor and sudden catastrophe. Above them, the steel furnaces burned with relentless hunger. The Leviathan demanded coal without interruption. And far beneath the surface, thousands of men labored in darkness to keep the machine alive, knowing that the same system forging the nation's railroads might one day collapse around them. Before sunrise, the mining towns were already awake. Lanterns flickered in narrow streets lined with identical wooden houses. Coal dust settled on rooftops, windowsills, and doorways, drifting constantly from the nearby shafts where the mines descended into darkness. The air carried a permanent smell of smoke and damp earth. Men gathered near the pithead in small clusters, their faces still shadowed by sleep. Most were immigrants or the sons of immigrants, workers from Ireland, Wales, Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe. They had come to the coal fields chasing wages that promised stability, yet the work awaiting them beneath the ground was among the most punishing labor in the industrial world. At the mine entrance stood the shaft cage. It was little more than an iron platform suspended by thick steel cables. When filled with workers, the cage dropped rapidly down vertical shafts, sometimes 300 to 500 feet deep. The descent lasted only seconds, but the darkness closed around them almost immediately. When the cage stopped, the men stepped into another world. The tunnels were narrow and low, carved directly through layers of coal and shale. In many sections, the ceilings measured less than 4 feet high, forcing miners to crouch or crawl as they moved deeper into the workings. Their only light came from oil lamps strapped to their caps. The flame flickered against the walls, illuminating rough timber supports wedged between floor and ceiling. These wooden beams were the only defense against thousands of tons of rock pressing down from above. The mine breathed slowly. Air circulated through ventilation shafts driven by surface fans, but the currents were weak in distant tunnels. Dust hung constantly in the air. Each swing of a pickaxe sent black particles drifting into the lamplight, coating clothing, skin, and lungs. The work itself was brutally physical. Miners attacked the coal seams using picks and shovels, cutting into the rock face one strike at a time. Once enough coal loosened, they loaded the chunks into small rail carts positioned along narrow tracks running through the tunnels. A full cart could weigh over half a ton. In smaller mines, boys known as trappers opened and closed ventilation doors to control airflow through the tunnels. Others, called breaker boys, worked above ground sorting coal by size as it passed along conveyor chutes. Many were no older than 10 years old. Inside the deeper workings, teams of mules or small locomotives hauled the loaded carts toward the shaft elevators. The rhythm of the mine rarely changed. Picks striking coal, cartwheels grinding along iron rails, timbers creaking under the pressure of shifting rock. For most miners, the greatest threat was not sudden explosion but gradual suffocation. The dust produced during coal cutting filled every breath with fine particles that lodged permanently inside the lungs. Over time, this dust hardened into scar tissue, creating a condition miners simply called black lung. Men who had worked underground for decades often developed a permanent cough. Their breathing grew shallow. Climbing a hill or staircase could become exhausting. Yet the miners rarely spoke openly about the long-term consequences of their labor. Immediate dangers demanded greater attention. Methane gas pockets formed unpredictably along the coal seams. Experienced miners learned to read subtle signs, strange stillness in the air, flickering lamp flames, or the faint hiss of escaping gas. A careless strike of metal against stone could ignite an explosion powerful enough to rip through entire sections of the mine. Collapses were equally feared. Timber supports weakened as tunnels expanded deeper into the earth. Sometimes the rock overhead began to groan before giving way. In other cases, the collapse came without warning, burying workers beneath tons of debris. When accidents occurred underground, rescue was difficult. Narrow tunnels prevented heavy equipment from entering. Fellow miners often had to dig through fallen rock with their own tools, racing against time to reach trapped co-workers before the air supply vanished. Despite these dangers, the daily routine continued with relentless regularity. Each miner was typically paid by the ton of coal extracted rather than by the hour. This system encouraged speed. The faster a crew could load carts, the more wages they earned. But working quickly increased the risk of mistakes, poorly supported tunnels, careless strikes of steel tools, or overlooked gas pockets. Every decision carried consequences. Above ground, the steel mills demanded uninterrupted coal shipments. Railroads expanding across the continent required more rails each month. Industrial production schedules left little room for delay. So the men underground pushed forward through darkness, heat, and dust. Their labor rarely appeared in the triumphant images of industrial progress. Photographs of gleaming locomotives and newly built rail lines rarely included the cramped tunnels where the fuel for that progress was mined. Yet without the miners, the entire system collapsed. The Leviathan's fire could only burn as long as coal continued rising from the depths, and every day thousands of workers descended into the earth to ensure that the machine never went hungry. By the final decades of the 19th century, entire cities had begun to revolve around fire. Wherever a major steel mill appeared, a new industrial landscape emerged almost overnight. Rail lines converged toward the furnaces like arteries feeding a central heart. Warehouses, machine shops, and repair yards spread outward in every direction. Soon after came the houses, rows of narrow wooden structures built quickly to shelter the swelling population of workers drawn by the promise of wages. These were the furnace cities. Places such as Pittsburgh, Bethlehem, and Homestead transformed from modest towns into roaring industrial centers. The skyline of each city was dominated not by church steeples or government buildings, but by the silhouettes of blast furnaces and smokestacks. At night, the sky itself seemed to burn. The blast furnaces glowed like enormous lanterns, their tapping operations releasing torrents of molten iron that lit the surrounding yards with flashes of orange and white. Sparks drifted into the air like swarms of fireflies before disappearing into clouds of smoke that rarely cleared. The noise never stopped. Steam engines pounded relentlessly inside the mills. Steel rollers thundered as they crushed glowing ingots into rails. Freight trains screeched along tracks carrying coal inward and steel outward. Workers described the sound as a permanent storm. A furnace complex required thousands of laborers operating in carefully timed shifts. Many mills ran 24 hours a day, dividing the workforce into rotating crews that kept production constant. When one shift ended, another entered the gates within minutes. The Leviathan could not afford silence. The neighborhoods surrounding the mills reflected the speed of industrial expansion. Housing was often built rapidly by the companies themselves, producing endless rows of identical homes constructed from rough timber. Streets were narrow and unpaved. Coal smoke settled onto every surface, coating buildings and laundry lines in black dust. Immigrant families filled these districts. Workers arrived from across Europe and beyond, bringing languages, traditions, and customs that blended into a dense industrial culture. Polish miners lived beside Italian furnace workers. Slovak laborers shared streets with Irish and Welsh families whose fathers had spent generations in coal and steel. Despite cultural differences, one experience united them all: work. A typical shift inside the steel mill lasted 12 hours. Furnace crews operated in temperatures so intense that clothing often smoldered near the fire channels. Rolling mill workers guided glowing steel using iron tongs, their faces illuminated by the constant blare of hot metal. Sparks struck the floor like bursts of lightning as rails passed through the final rollers. In summer, the heat inside the mills could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, the contrast between freezing air outside and furnace heat inside created clouds of steam that filled entire buildings. Workers moved through this environment coated in sweat and soot, their muscles strained by the effort of handling materials that weighed hundreds of pounds. Injuries were common. A moment of distraction could place a worker directly in the path of a moving steel bar or rail. Molten metal occasionally splashed from tapping channels, leaving severe burns. Conveyor systems and rolling machines contained exposed gears capable of pulling clothing and sometimes entire bodies into their mechanisms. Yet the work continued with relentless rhythm. Outside the mill gates, the furnace cities developed their own industrial routine. Company stores sold food and clothing to workers paid in wages that often returned immediately to their employers through rent and purchases. Saloons and boarding houses lined the streets near the mills, offering brief escape from the grinding schedule of industrial labor. Children played in streets where the air smelled constantly of smoke. Women washed coal dust from clothing that returned blackened after every shift. Churches filled on Sundays with families seeking moments of quiet beneath skies permanently darkened by soot. Despite the hardships, many workers believed they were participating in something historic. They could see the rails leaving the mills by trainload. They knew those rails would stretch across mountains and deserts, carrying locomotives into regions where no railroads had existed before. The industrial cities stood at the center of a transformation that was reshaping the entire nation. But as production accelerated, tension grew inside these communities. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and uneven wages began to erode the fragile balance between labor and industry. Workers who powered the furnaces and mines increasingly questioned whether the rewards of industrial progress were being shared fairly. In furnace cities built around steel and coal, the pressure was rising. And like the blast furnaces themselves, pressure left unchecked rarely remains stable for long. Industrial systems can endure immense strain for years, but eventually pressure finds a point of release. By the late 19th century, the coalfields and furnace cities had reached a moment of dangerous tension. Production demands continued rising. Railroad companies pushed relentlessly for new rails as tracks advanced westward across plains, deserts, and mountain ranges. Steel mills responded by increasing output, running furnaces longer and pushing workers through exhausting shifts. The machine expanded faster than the people sustaining it. Miners underground faced deeper shafts, thinner seams, and greater risks. Steel workers endured longer hours beside furnaces that burned without pause. Wages often failed to rise at the same pace as production demands, leaving workers trapped between increasing danger and stagnant pay. Many lived in company towns where the same corporation controlled housing, stores, and employment. Leaving the job could mean losing everything. Inside these communities, resentment began to grow quietly. Conversations in boarding houses and saloons turned toward the same questions repeated across mining camps and mill districts. Why were the men risking their lives earning so little? Why were safety improvements so slow? Why did production quotas continue to rise even after deadly accidents? These questions gradually evolved into organization. Workers began forming labor associations, early unions designed to give miners and steelworkers a collective voice in negotiations with powerful industrial companies. Meetings were often held in secret, away from company officials who viewed organized labor as a direct threat to production. The demands were not revolutionary. Most miners and steel workers simply wanted safer conditions, shorter working hours, and wages that reflected the risks they faced daily. A 10-hour workday, rather than 12 or 14 hours, became a central demand in many industrial districts. But for the corporations managing the steel industry, even modest concessions appeared dangerous. Executives feared that any slowdown in production could disrupt the delicate industrial chain connecting mines, furnaces, and rail mills. Delays meant missed railroad contracts. Missed contracts meant lost revenue. And lost revenue threatened the enormous investments required to maintain massive steel complexes. So companies resisted. Negotiations often stalled. When workers threatened strikes, industrial leaders prepared their own response. Private security forces were hired to protect company property. State militias were sometimes placed on standby in case unrest escalated. The confrontation between labor and industry was no longer theoretical. It was approaching reality. One of the most famous flashpoints occurred in 1892, when tensions at a major steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, erupted into open conflict. Workers protested wage cuts and changes to union agreements. When negotiations collapsed, the company attempted to reopen the mill using non-union labor. Armed guards were brought in to secure the facility. Workers responded by organizing picket lines and blocking river access to the mill. The standoff quickly escalated. Gunfire erupted along the riverbanks as guards attempted to land barges carrying replacement workers. For hours, the industrial dispute turned into a violent confrontation. When the smoke cleared, several men on both sides were dead. The Homestead conflict became a symbol of a broader struggle unfolding across the industrial nation. Coal miners launched strikes demanding improved ventilation and safety measures in the mines. Steel workers organized protests against exhausting shift schedules inside the mills. Companies responded with lockouts, blacklist policies, and in some cases, armed force. For the workers, the struggle was about survival. For the corporations, it was about maintaining the unstoppable momentum of industrial expansion. Caught between these forces stood the steel Leviathan itself, a machine that required constant fuel, constant labor, and constant motion to sustain the railroad network spreading across the continent. But the very workers feeding that machine were beginning to resist its demands, and as tensions deepened across mining towns and furnace cities, the industrial system that had once appeared invincible was approaching the moment of reckoning. Because sometimes the greatest threat to a machine is not mechanical failure, sometimes it is the people forced to keep it running. In industrial systems driven by speed and scale, catastrophe is rarely a matter of if, it is a matter of when. Throughout the coal fields of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, warnings had accumulated for years. Miners reported unstable tunnels. Engineers noted inadequate ventilation systems. Inspectors occasionally raised concerns about explosive gas levels deep inside expanding mines. Yet production demands continued to grow. Railroads required more steel. Steel required more coal. And coal continued to be extracted from deeper and more dangerous seams beneath the earth. Eventually, the hidden dangers erupted. One of the most devastating examples occurred in 1907 at the Monongah coal mines in West Virginia. On the morning of December 6th, hundreds of miners descended into the tunnels for what appeared to be an ordinary shift. The mine had been operating at enormous capacity, feeding the furnaces of an expanding steel industry. Shortly after the men began work, something ignited deep within the underground network. Whether it was a spark from a steel tool or a flame from a miner's lamp was never fully determined. What investigators later confirmed was the presence of methane gas and suspended coal dust throughout the tunnels, an explosive mixture waiting for ignition. The blast that followed was immense. A shock wave tore through the mine shafts, traveling at terrifying speed through miles of underground passages. Timber supports shattered instantly. Rail carts were hurled through tunnels. Flames raced through the air currents, igniting additional pockets of gas as they spread. The ground above the mine trembled. Smoke and debris erupted from the shaft openings as the explosion forced its way toward the surface. Nearby residents reported hearing the blast miles away, followed by an eerie silence as the mine's ventilation system collapsed. Rescue efforts began almost immediately. Miners from neighboring operations rushed to the site, descending into the damaged tunnels in desperate attempts to reach survivors, but the destruction underground was overwhelming. Fires continued burning in sealed sections of the mine. Toxic gases filled the air where ventilation had failed. Many of the tunnels were completely blocked. As days passed, the scale of the disaster became clear. More than 360 miners had been killed, making the Monongah explosion one of the deadliest mining disasters in American history. Entire families were wiped out in a single morning. Some victims were immigrants whose relatives overseas would not learn their fate for months. The tragedy shocked the nation. Newspapers across the country carried headlines describing the devastation in the coal fields. Photographs of grieving families and shattered mine entrances forced the public to confront the hidden cost of the industrial economy. But Monongah was not an isolated event. Similar disasters had occurred for decades across mining regions in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Alabama, and Colorado. Explosions, cave-ins, and fires had already claimed thousands of lives by the turn of the century. What made Monongah different was its scale. The sheer number of deaths forced government officials, engineers, and industrial leaders to acknowledge what miners had known for years. The system feeding the nation's steel industry contained structural dangers that could no longer be ignored. Public pressure began to mount. Investigations were launched to determine how the disaster had occurred and whether it could have been prevented. Engineers studied ventilation systems, gas detection methods, and mine safety procedures with renewed urgency. The explosion had revealed something undeniable. The Leviathan could devour not only individual workers but entire communities. And as the smoke cleared above the ruined mine shafts, the country began to ask a question that had been avoided for decades. If the industrial machine required coal to survive, how many lives should it be allowed to consume in the process? The Monongah disaster marked a turning point. For decades, industrial expansion had been driven almost entirely by speed and output. Railroads demanded steel, steel demanded coal. Companies responded by pushing production deeper into mines and harder inside the mills. Safety often followed far behind the pace of growth, but the scale of tragedy at Monongah made the cost impossible to ignore. Public outrage spread quickly through newspapers, political chambers, and industrial boardrooms. The image of hundreds of miners buried beneath collapsed tunnels forced a national reckoning with the dangers hidden inside the industrial system. In 1910, the United States government established the Bureau of Mines, an organization tasked with studying mining disasters and improving safety practices across the country. For the first time, scientific investigation became central to mine safety. Engineers and chemists began analyzing the behavior of methane gas and coal dust inside underground tunnels. Researchers conducted controlled explosions to understand how ignition spread through mine passages. Ventilation systems were redesigned to circulate fresh air more effectively through expanding networks of shafts. New technologies followed. Improved gas detection lamps allowed miners to identify dangerous methane concentrations before explosions occurred. Electric lighting gradually replaced open-flame lamps in many mines, reducing the risk of accidental ignition. Stone dust barriers were introduced to limit the spread of coal dust explosions. Mining itself slowly changed. Stronger roof supports replaced the fragile timber beams that had once held up miles of tunnels. Emergency escape routes became mandatory in many operations. Mine inspectors gained greater authority to shut down dangerous sites until safety improvements were made. Progress was uneven. Some companies resisted regulations that increased costs or slowed production. Enforcement varied widely between regions, and many smaller mines continued operating with minimal oversight, but the direction of change had begun. Labor organizations also gained strength during this period. Coal miners' unions expanded their influence, pushing for standardized wages, shorter working hours, and stronger safety protections underground. In the steel mills, gradual improvements appeared as well. Protective equipment became more common for furnace workers. Industrial engineering introduced more efficient workflows that reduced the need for constant manual handling of heavy materials. New steel-making methods, such as the open hearth furnace, allowed for greater control over production temperatures and chemical composition. The Leviathan was evolving. It remained immense, powerful, and hungry for coal. But the system surrounding it was beginning to acknowledge a truth long understood by the workers inside it. Industrial progress could not rely solely on human sacrifice. The transformation was slow. Mines continued to collapse. Explosions still occurred. Steel workers still endured exhausting shifts beside blazing furnaces. Yet each reform, each new safety mechanism, each strengthened regulation represented a small shift in the balance between production and protection. The industrial machine that had once seemed unstoppable was gradually being reshaped by the very disasters it had produced. And as the 20th century advanced, the Leviathan that had forged the nation's railroads began to leave behind a legacy far more complicated than steel alone. By the early 20th century, the steel rails stretched farther than anyone in the previous generation had imagined. From Atlantic harbors to Pacific ports, from the forests of the north to the deserts of the southwest, railroads had carved permanent pathways through the continent. Freight trains hauled grain, timber and machinery across distances that once required weeks of difficult travel. Passenger locomotives carried people toward new cities, rising along the expanding network. The nation had been remade in steel. Where isolated settlements once struggled to trade with distant markets, railroads now connected farms, factories, and ports into a single industrial economy. Towns appeared beside rail junctions. Cities expanded along rail corridors. Entire regions transformed as goods and people moved faster than any previous generation had experienced. The Leviathan had accomplished what it was built to do. Its furnaces had forged millions of tons of rails. Its mills had shaped the metal backbone of a modern nation. Its fires had burned through decades of relentless production. Yet the railroads themselves told only part of the story. Beneath the steel tracks stretching across mountains and plains lay a hidden foundation, one not made of iron or stone but of labor. Coal miners who descended daily into unstable tunnels, steel workers who stood beside furnaces blazing hotter than volcanic rock, immigrant families who built lives in furnace cities where the sky rarely cleared of smoke. Their work powered the transformation of a continent. The industrial age often celebrated its machines, locomotives roaring across bridges, furnaces pouring rivers of molten metal, factories filled with spinning gears and pistons. These images captured the visible triumph of engineering and production. But machines never truly operated alone. Behind every blast furnace stood miners hauling coal from the depths of the earth. Behind every mile of railroad stood workers guiding glowing steel through rolling mills. Behind every train crossing the continent stood communities shaped by the demands of industrial labor. The Leviathan had always required more than fuel. It required human endurance. In time, new technologies would begin to replace parts of the system that once dominated the landscape. Diesel locomotives replaced many coal-burning engines. Modern steelmaking methods introduced more efficient processes. Regulations slowly improved safety in mines and mills. The great furnaces of the 19th century no longer defined the industrial skyline as they once had. Yet the legacy of that era remained embedded in the infrastructure of modern society. Many of the railroad routes laid during the Age of Steam still serve as major transportation corridors. Cities that grew around coal mines and steel mills continue to exist as industrial centers long after the original furnaces cooled. The physical rails endure, but the memory of the workers who forged them often fades into the background of history. The steel Leviathan built a nation's railroads. It conquered distance. It powered economic expansion. But its story cannot be measured only in miles of track or tons of steel. Because hidden beneath those achievements lies another record one written in the tunnels of coal mines, in the heat of blast furnaces, and in the lives of the men and families who sustained the machine that helped shape the modern world.